Thank you very much for your very rich but succinct presentations. I think you've allowed us almost an hour, 50 minutes of conversation now. I just want to start by saying that we at the New School over the past, 8 to 10 years have really talked a lot about wicked problems and disciplinary silos. And Michael, I think you do tell us how wicked this problem is. But what was really remarkable for me is not only the diversity of disciplines of the four speakers here, geoscience, engineering, planning and law, political science, but the unorthodox routes you've all taken in your careers. I think the common driver being an incredible public-mindedness that seems to be driving you away from more traditional forms of disciplinary practice. So I think that's something here that might be of great interest to the students to hear more about. And so Guy, I think you've been the engineer who's brought designers to these important issues and have brought say architects who've worked at a certain scale and landscape architects who've worked within certain constraints to take on huge new challenges and have at the same time put them into public arenas which they might not be there. So it's an unusual act for an engineer to take on. And this wonderful combination of planning and law that gave us Jerold's, one of my favorite books about New York is Publicly Owned Private Spaces. It really tells you a lot about this city and its kind of half public-mindedness and half private-mindedness. I mean, it's really a remarkable book, and research behind it, especially. But you're also a great storyteller. So I don't know if that's the planner's side, probably more the lawyer's side. And then the political scientist who's taking on the politics of energy, I think is really for me quite important. And you're a bit. I've never heard a political sci-fi guy. So I don't know if anyone's called you that, but I think you're very much the first political scientist I've met who is imagining a world where our energy will be available through handheld devices and small window shades. So I think it's quite a remarkable panel, and I'm looking forward to some discussion. So my opening question, and I invite everyone in the audience to think of your questions, and you'll be invited down to the microphones. But just to get things started, my opening question is, climate change demands we change. Why aren't we? And I think you all show, I think personally, you're making change, you're change makers, and changing the world in a way that even your disciplines might not have trained you to change the world. So I guess we are changing, so, but we're not changing enough. And so how do we change more, perhaps, is the more accurate question.
You know, I have one. I was thinking about the question, obviously, because that's what the panel and conference in some ways are about. One of the reasons why change isn't happening fast enough, in my view, is that we're getting a little bit distracted by people's sort of pet solutions to the problem. And I think in my field, the pet solution to the climate problem is often there should be a global treaty that makes everybody limit their use of fossil fuels. And in the US, there should be a carbon tax, which would force the issue. And it's often economists and natural scientists, my colleagues at the Earth Institute, that are pushing these things. And as a political scientist, I say, okay, what Congress is going to pass this carbon tax, because I don't see one, and what Senate is going to approve a treaty like this, because I don't see that either. So if I see two politically infeasible solutions, then I start to think, well, what could work? And I think what could work, and we're actually beginning to see the start of it. Krugman wrote a column about it earlier, I guess it was last week. We're starting to see a reduction in the cost of renewable energy. Now, in a sense, that's going to continue because the technology of renewable energy will get less expensive, and the basic fuel is going to stay the same price, essentially zero. The opposite's going to happen with fossil fuels. As they get scarce and get harder to get out of the ground and have to be transported more to more people, they'll get more expensive. And so over time, it's inevitable that you're going to see these two paths cross. Some people think it's happened already, some people don't think it's happened. So one way to work on it, and this is the way that a lot of my colleagues have been working on it, let's raise the price of fossil fuels so that renewables become more competitive. What that does is it makes people think you're trying to cut into their addiction. And as if I'm addicted to energy, you're making my addiction get more expensive. And it's like raising the price of heroin. It's a bad idea if you have a bunch of addicts around. So instead, what about lowering the price of energy? What about, if renewable energy can do that, then you have a vehicle for actually solving the energy problem, which does at least put us on one of those lower trajectories that Professor Oppenheimer showed us earlier today.
It's not an and/or proposition. So a lot of effort was put in over a 20-year period beginning in about 1991 to develop an international infrastructure, which you referred to. And, you know, it didn't solve the problem, but it did create a lot of information sharing, a change in expectations. So, for instance, the reason the price of photovoltaics and wind have come down recently is largely because the Chinese government did what you would have a government do, made a massive investment. But that investment was keyed often under an expectation, partly because it happened before the Copenhagen meeting in 2009, that there would be a successful global accord. There may yet be a successful global accord over a period of, you know, I think you're right in the short term. I think over the period of 10 or 20 years, we need to uniformize what should be in the near term many diverse political and scientific and technological efforts, which will eventually need to be brought together. So you know, a lot of what happens that moves in the direction of solving the problem is an accident or has nothing to do with any intentional policy. And my view is that what you need to do is look for the things that are developing anyway, encourage the things that would move you in the right direction, discourage the things that would move you in the wrong direction, and eventually you sort of lurch toward a good solution, which eventually a treaty helps bring together. I want to make one other point while I have the microphone. You painted a very sort of an encouraging picture of what could be done if governments just sort of paid attention and made things happen on the energy front. And I agree with you that that needs to be a big part of what happens. There isn't enough R&D. Eventually, you need to keep in mind that governments have made an awful lot of mistakes on the energy front too. And that a lot of technologies developed out of, say, the space program or military exigencies, which never got cheap enough, like fuel cells, or never provided on the civilian side what they were supposed to provide, like in the US, nuclear power, never got cheap enough, had a lot of problems, still does. And there have been other debacles that had nothing to do with the military, particularly like synfuels, biofuels. And that, so the energy terrain is fraught. And we need a better way to, if we're going to throw a gazillion dollars into public funding, we need to think about it more carefully and go about it in a much more considered way and give the market what the market is due and give what the market can't do, let the government do that. And we've sort of lurched sideways and sometimes overdone it in terms of government technology determinism, and sometimes just underdone it by not spending enough money.
I agree with almost everything you said, Michael, and I think that the caveat I would put in to it is that this transition from what government does to what the private sector does is a tricky transition. There's no question about it. The problem we have today is we've delegitimized government. And so government as a player in all of this has been removed. I mean, all these jokes about Al Gore inventing the internet. Well, Al Gore did invent the internet. He was the guy who put the legislation forward to move the internet out of the Defense Department and to make it commercial. Over and over again, the dialogue on this is dominated by self-interest and very, very conservative forces in our society, and they've made it impossible to have the kind of creative and intelligent discussion that you're just describing. But I think we have to have it. There's no question about it, that we have to have a more sophisticated conversation about what R&D and how to move it from the public sector into the private.
Just to throw an optimistic point of view maybe at that, I think I totally agree with you that in what somebody called the age of Reagan, we've had this problem with our understanding of the role of government. I think to some extent that's focused on the role of the federal government and the examples of the fiasco with the website and so on. I mean, in the end, it got fixed. And I think one of the lessons of those of us who've been involved in different ways in some of these initiatives is that there are generally screw-ups at the beginning, but eventually we get around, and the same is true in war, the same is true in many situations like that. What's, I think, quite interesting, having spent my adult life in the age of Reagan, is the way in which there have been a number of local initiatives that have emerged, going all the way back to the history of how earthquake engineering evolved from something that was first happening in California. When I came back to New York in 1982, we didn't have earthquake regulations here. After about 11 years, we did. There was a national strategy that was developed through the 80s and the 90s. I think you can find that also in what impact Bloomberg's administration has had. And the panel on climate change that we sit on is the first local panel on climate change that exists in the United States. It's a great initiative, and I think if more states did that, or cities did that, in flood management, North Carolina, for a number of years, had an extremely sophisticated program of mapping and management, mostly of riverine flooding, and then they outlawed climate change. But there are a lot of examples that have happened from bottom up, and that have, emission control in California, and on and on. Coastal, you alluded to the Coastal Council. Certain states have coastal commissions and have a framework to manage the coast, California, Rhode Island, et cetera. So I think, going to your comment about what we can do as designers and so on, that models like that, highlighting them, developing them even before they start to come into play is a significant role that we can all play.
I'd like to ask you, since you've been participating in this Rebuild by Design competition, whether you think the method of competitions is a good method for coming up with creative, useful ideas that would otherwise not arise.
Thank you for that question. So going back to 1963, Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote a memo to Kennedy saying that it was really important that we build noble buildings for the federal government, that we represent ourselves to ourselves through much better architecture than we were getting at the time. And that triggered a whole chain of events over time, leading to many different things, including the Design Excellence Program at the General Service Administration, led by, in fact, proteges of Moynihan. So there's lots of people out in the world now who have been produced by the good sense and good taste of Moynihan. What's interesting about that, and I think it goes to rebuild by design, is that always been this tension, and if you follow the history of the Design Excellence Program, and we had our own Design Excellence Program, by the way, here in New York with David Burney under the last administration, modeled after the GSA. And in fact, at a time when Bush was doing everything in his power to gut the Design Excellence Program, New York was keeping the idea alive. So there's also that interesting relationship between the two. The reason why it was gutted under Republican administrations was because patronage is really important, not just to Republicans, but I think there's always been this back and forth between the allocation of federal resources through, block grants, or the allocation of resources through the building of a courthouse or a federal office building, to the judge's brother who's an architect and his cousin who's a contractor, versus through some kind of design excellence program, bringing in people who try to lift the bar. And it goes back and forth. What's fascinating about Rebuild by Design is it's trying to do that in a different venue. Historically, we've done a good job through buildings. We've not done a good job through infrastructure. And this is a program now where infrastructure is being approached with the same way that Moynihan pushed us for buildings.
Yeah, I just want to add an observation to the discussion, because I think we saw a huge range of scales, and if we started off the day on the scale of just the human psyche, global projections, but then the scale, Guy, you were showing that you're currently working on is John Gottman's megalopolis scale of the Boston, Washington, and even further south in Norfolk. And so the local politics, in relationship to the federal government, even if Congress won't pass something, the Army Corps is taking that on in relationship to local things. And so government acts, governance as opposed to government, and different agencies can act at big scale, even if the national legislature isn't passing certain laws. I do want to open up this last half hour or so of the panel to the audience. So if you have some questions, please file down. And we'll begin with you. I just want to remind everybody to identify yourself and just orient us to where your question is coming from by just who you are. And also, we're asking for questions, not statements. So if anyone makes a philosophical statement, I'll interrupt you.
Hello. First of all, thank you for your excellent presentations. My name is Emma Kraus. I work for the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources. I work on a grant called the Sunshot Grant. It's a federal grant that looks to reduce soft costs around solar PV. I work with a bunch of different New England regional states, and we work in local municipalities. I coordinate with the region, the New England states, to see how we can reduce soft costs not only in our states, but across the border. One of the other big initiatives that Massachusetts is working on at the moment is a resiliency program, where we're giving grants that's been designated through energy initiatives at the Department of Energy Resources. We're giving these grants to different municipalities for coastal initiatives and so forth. So with that context in mind, as someone who is doing this local work across the 3 different levels of government, what can we do better? What can we do better to work across the different states, to work across the different towns? The most common thing that I run into that's a problem is different towns, different states, different regulations, different zonings. As Professor Cohen spoke to, something like net metering, that is completely different in New Hampshire and Vermont than it is in Massachusetts. With an understanding that this is very much in play, how can we do better? How can we finesse around these edges and all work together?
General point, and recognizing that there are certain forces in our society that prefer uniform solutions, and I'll point, for instance, to the discussions going now on about the Common Core in education, for instance. Certain things are not going to happen nationally. Land use standards, never going to happen. So in certain areas, there are national standards like energy efficiency, air pollution, and others there just aren't going to be. And the closer you get to the land issue that you brought up, the less and less likely there is that there is going to be a national standard. So what you have to do in that case, and what is the value of the federal system, is to look for ways to use the diversity as laboratories and ways to stimulate innovation, and then provide pathways where that innovation can spread, not by mandate, but because people learn and see it as having high value. Now, I'm for a strong federal government. I'm not saying this as someone who's, dyed-in-the-wool libertarian. But let's face it, there are certain things that are never going to happen in this country. So we have to accept the reality and then use that and do jujitsu on it to make something good come out of it.
Something very similar. That's the right answer, that you basically benchmark against other jurisdictions and try to show people a better way to do things. At the same time, particularly at the state level, most state governments do have the capacity to make those kinds of rules beyond, without needing to go to the federal level, and so that can help. And again, the other answer, and as it's funny because when I was in grad school, I was always against technological fixes, but if you can figure out a technology that's cheaper and more effective, then you get around the problems with, all these soft costs, for example, because you don't have to worry about, are you allowed to put this stuff on the roof, because you got a better place to put it.
Thank you for your question.
How does it? Oh, hello. Yes. Hi there. My name's Karina. I'm doing some research at the moment on sustainable business practices in an ecologically sustainable world. And my question is for Professor Cohen. You had in your presentation, I think, a statement that said if we solve the energy crisis, we solve the sustainability challenge, or something along those lines. And I was confused by this statement because it implied to me that what's creating the conditions of unsustainability at the moment would be energy. And I think actually what's actually creating the conditions of unsustainability is a system of provision of material goods and services via an economic system that requires growth to function effectively. So I guess my question for you is, do you really believe that statement, or is it just something to say in your presentation to make your point across? Obviously, energy is very important, but I'm wondering about other challenges of biodiversity loss and so on that would still be required even if we had renewable energy.
On consumption, people think that we can reduce consumption. I think we have to change the nature of consumption. I think that we have to use technology and manage our ecosystems in a more effective way than we do today. The idea that we're going to go back to the earth and live at one with nature, I mean, it'd be nice if we could all have 150 acres on the Hudson like Pete Seeger, may he rest in peace, had. But no, that's not. We're going to be living in cities, and we're going to be managing a high-throughput economy that's going to be very resource dependent. The question is, can we maintain the planet and its ability to produce the things we need, food, water, and air in particular, without destroying it? Energy, if it's low cost enough and if it doesn't poison itself, can do a lot of transformative things. It can, for example, desalinate water. It can, for example, if you look at most of the pollution control devices that we have, they're very, very energy intensive. And so forgetting about the fact that fossil fuels have this incredibly destructive impact on the planet, the way we've designed our economy, what's called the throwaway economy, you use something and toss it away, that has to go. Consumption, though, can change. The nature of consumption can change. So I'll tell another little story about driving off to college with my hi-fi and my records and my books, filling up my trunk of my big car, and then driving my daughter off to her college, and she had more music and more information on her iPad and her iPhone. So if that iPad and iPhone was toxics-free, which someday I hope it will be, that's a different kind of consumption pattern than the one that I had. So we have to talk about economic growth, but on a different base, one that is more mindful of the impact on the environment.
I think the question of what designers can do, and your allusion to sci-fi, it would really be interesting to imagine a world where energy was effectively free. Mm-hmm. And think about whether that's necessarily a sustainable world. I think that there are many practices, and I think your point is very well taken. There are many practices associated with consumption that do a lot of harm that have nothing to do with the cost of energy. And so stepping aside from that question and imagining a world where energy is free is a fantastic exercise for designers and planners to think about, because it highlights other things that we may not be thinking about that we should be thinking about.
Hello? Yes, hi. My name is Kathy McConnell, and I originally learned about this whole subject 30 years ago when I was at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, and have been watching the slow grinding, nothing happening for decades. I would like Dr. Cohen and anyone else who wants to speak to revisit the idea of a carbon tax. It seems to have a lot of promise, and there does seem to be some movement even in the conservative ranks to look at this as a possible solution. When you get people as diverse as George Shultz and James Henson coming out together saying that this would be perhaps the most effective means to enable the free market to kind of push things in the right direction. And when you're having trouble getting the government, when we don't seem to have elected officials who trust in the government to make bold plans in this area, but seem to be in love with the free market. And if you had a gradually increasing carbon tax where people could plan and know, I'm sorry?
You asked the question.
Okay, all right.
One of them is the Tea Party. They're not going to pass a carbon tax, and they control the House of Representatives. The second is China. The third is India. So you pass a carbon tax in this country, and most of the use of fossil fuels is going to be outside this country anyway. So it doesn't, the problem with the climate problem is that it's caused everywhere. And so the public policy solutions require a global solution. I personally, I agree with Professor Oppenheimer that the IPCC process and the treaty process has been incredibly important in moving the political agenda and educating people. It has not resulted in a public policy that is going to reduce the use of fossil fuels. So what we need is a different approach. And to me, the approach is not to raise the price of fossil fuels, but to lower the price of renewable energy through the use of research and development. And the reason I say that is because I wish the other way would work, because I think it has a kind of elegance to it. It's just not going to happen. So since it's not going to happen, I'd rather focus on something that could happen. I think one of our problems is we find ourselves addicted to an elegant solution, or attracted, I should say, to an elegant solution, and we push it and we push it and we push it. It doesn't matter that it has no political feasibility attached to it. Let's look for something that could actually happen.
Let me make a couple of comments on that. Again, not complete disagreement here, but a difference of emphasis. Going back to the Chinese and the photovoltaics example, again, one of the reasons the Chinese kept pushing on that and pushed it so the price has gone down by a factor of 4 at least in the last 5 years or so, is because there was a tremendous market for photovoltaics in Europe. The reason that market existed is because of the Kyoto Protocol. And even though Kyoto failed to a certain extent because the US pulled out, Canada is worse than the US, and you can go on and on and on, the reality is that part of the world did follow it, did stick to certain objectives, did effectively put a price on carbon, and that gave the Chinese somebody to sell to. The Germans have gone nuts with photovoltaic cells, and even the US, though it didn't have a comprehensive solution, the renewable portfolio standards in the state that I work in have resulted in, PVs all over the state. So it's a little more complicated. I agree with you that that envisioning an idealistic solution, that's not going to work per se. But a lot of stuff spun out of that, and I think, you have to remember, generically talking about a price on carbon is the way you ought to look at it. We came very close in 2009 to having legislation. Wouldn't have been a carbon tax, it would have been cap and trade. Then a senator from Massachusetts passed away, the balance in the Senate changed, and politics got even uglier after that. But one of these days, I think there will be a price on carbon.
We will have a price on carbon through the regulation that EPA will finally get in about a decade from now. But I think that, what I'm looking for is a real motor that changes how people behave and consume. And the analogies I keep thinking about are things like, how did people go from broadcast TV to cable TV? How did they go from landlines to cell phones? How did they go from VHS to streaming video? And those kinds of changes in mass behavior are often fueled by changes in technology. And that's what I'm looking for on the energy side.
Those are interlinked. The regulatory changes drive technology. Technology facilitates regulatory changes. It all kind of fits together.
I'm just going to interject my own question now because I'm feeling we're too much on the energy side. And I think, Guy, you've been thinking about, got me thinking about designing the free energy, and I just want to hear from Jerold a little bit because I'm trying to imagine a different relationship between the public and private. I mean, your talk has, and again, I'm speaking as a designer, and okay, I have free energy, and I have a different relationship between public and private, and so the way American cities have been plotted, since, well, before Jefferson, but can you give me a sci-fi planning legal system for adapting cities that doesn't lock us into this current system we have today? I mean, it's just completely off the wall. I just wanted to bring us back to the physical city.
I don't think actually it's science fiction. I mean, we are having really very robust and full discussions about how to deal with the effects of climate change, and in particular sea level rise and its impacts that it will have on flooding along coastal areas in particular. There are other impacts, of course, of climate change that have been mentioned, including heat effects, et cetera. The discussions are very, very good. The reports are very, very good, and the mechanisms that have been proposed are sort of obvious mechanisms to those in the field. So whether it's, armor or retreat or whatever word one wants to put, whether it's resilience or sustainability, I mean, the words keep changing. But we have the strategies, and I think they are going to be driven simply, finally, by the market, effectively, by the fact that there will be this flooding, whether it's a public market or a private market, and things will be finally righted in the system. We'll have, I think, more of an introduction of insurance strategies. Risk probabilities are going to play a major role. But the question is, will these happen in time? How far behind will we actually be? Are the signaling mechanisms adequate for us to act in time? And I think that's already been referenced.
15 years, if I'm not incorrect, Michael, right?
15 years of...
We have to change before it's irreversible.
I don't want, look, we should have changed 20 years ago. I don't want to put a number on it. It's always, it always should have been better than it has been, but it always could be worse than it is, than it will be. I mean, just, we're always in progress of muddling through. That's never going to change. So let's do the best we can.
Okay. Go back to the audience. Yeah. No, I think it was double over here. I'm doing 2 and 1. Sorry.
My name is Sharon Anderson. I'm an environmental educator with Cooperative Extension, and I'm interested in what the panelists think about the content of the draft New York State Energy Plan, and in general, the role of energy plans at municipal and institutional levels to drive change.
You should have gone to that side.
Your question is too tough for this panel. Come on, Stephen.
But you can speak to it. Anyway.
Because I haven't read it. No, I tend to actually only respond to things I know something about. But what is it in the plan that you particularly want to comment about?
I think it's just this general issue of how do we change government.
Well, I know a few things that New York State's doing. I have a friend who's working to try to reduce the use of energy in New York State buildings, and they're focusing on that pretty intensely. The points that were raised about what Bloomberg did here in New York City in his administration to challenge places like Columbia University to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and all the rest. And these things are having an impact. I think that, in fact, in cities like New York are using less energy per capita today than they did a decade ago. And so there is, these plans are having some impact. Now, what do we do about generation going forward? What do we do about Indian Point going forward? I don't know if any of that's in the plan, but we do have an issue in New York with a very old energy infrastructure that we need to do some hard thinking about. But I don't know enough about that plan to comment on it.
My name is Jenny Whiteman, and I'm a researcher at Cornell on greenhouse gas life cycle analysis, and I'm also a conceptual artist. And I guess what I want to get at here is that, when the United States was founded, we had, representation based on population and size, but our population has increased tremendously, and our representation has not. And what I like so much about this panel today was that it covered these different topic areas. And I'm wondering, how can we change, or what are your ideas of how you and us, all of us, can start taking other kinds of real leadership roles where we find our peers that we work well with and can start developing or drafting texts or policies in ways that we change representation instead of just writing academic articles or whatever, because I'm having something of a crisis as a scientist, because if I work on one more little factoid for the argument on climate change, I'm just gonna, I mean, if you don't know, you can ask God, but I don't know, he's not done too much for me personally. But my point here is, we have a high level of conceptual intelligence in this room and in this country, right? And, instead of looking to the federal government, which I agree, as a child growing up, like looking at maps on road trips and seeing like the green line where the road hadn't been developed and feeling, excited about our policy to make the roads, how can we make this sort of map the way the New York subway system is making advertisements on the subway, like we're making these improvements, like how can we sort of advocate for ourselves and our roles to become the leaders in the lieu of the fact that, our Senate is always been 100 people, but our population is changing. So New York State is probably the equivalent of the US when it was founded in terms of its size and capacity and will and intelligence.
The Senate wasn't always 100 people, but let me make a suggestion.
Okay.
If whether you live, I say this when I talk locally, we have a governor who wants to run for president, and he's calibrated. Both. I meant both. I live in New York, so we went Cuomo, but my other governor wants to run for president. He's damaged now, but he may still run. Both of these people have been very careful about what they say about this issue. Cuomo had a few words to say when Sandy hit, and he spoke the words climate change. He hasn't said much about it since. Christie has been very interesting. He pulled the state out of the compact called RGGI, which is a regional greenhouse gas reduction compact. But he said, but I believe in the science, and he's let the solar program go on, so because the industry there likes it. So he's tried to play it both ways. These guys, you have a lot of leverage on those two guys right now. So instead of just sitting still and waiting for them to decide they're going to say something or not about climate change, if you really want to organize it on it, you have some very, very good leverage because the media is here, the media is on these guys, and you find a way to put them on the hot spot. That's the easiest thing I can imagine right now.
I think also the use of social media as a political tool is just in its infancy. I mean, certainly Barack Obama, when he first ran, figured out a way to raise $350 million that way for his first presidential campaign. And there is a potential, despite the size of the country, which is obviously growing, representation is becoming trickier in many respects. But you do have this social media and internet that didn't exist before, and creates, I mean, everybody in this room is potentially a video reporter. And so that we've not really studied the political impact of that, but it's very clear that it's beginning to have an impact, and that does create some different space for democracy.
I guess I'm just asking, how can you work together to design ways to leverage your work together? That's like thinking.
We'll appear on panels together at the new school.
Because I'm a structural engineer, is because of this guy. And we became friends because my wife did a garden for him, and then I got interested in climate change, and then I tried to figure out a way that I could help, and he told me how. So we have been working together for 10 years, and one of the things that we achieved with the work that Brian was referring to is, for many years after Westway, the idea of doing anything in the water around New York was anathema, because we would, do harm in any way that we intervened. We changed that with the project that we worked on together a couple years ago, in a way that Amanda Burden, who was director of city planning at the time, she said, we changed the DNA of the city. And she adopted this idea that we had been promoting, and she turned it into the water of the 6th borough of the city, which was great. So now the planning for the waterfront was transformed, and all of these things eventually evolved into the point that some of these ideas that you saw up on the wall may get built, rebuilt by design. One of the projects, one of the best projects, was by Kate Orff for building a string of breakwaters off of Staten Island, which would do a huge amount to protect those communities. This all started with this guy telling me I should think about climate change. So a lot of good things can happen out of that collaboration.
Yeah, and where'd you go? So I was going to say, find some designers. Cornell has a good art and architecture school.
Hi. My name is Gabriel Avgerinos. I used to be for 30 years in fossil fuels. I'm now in renewables and very, very interested in climate change. Professor Cohen, you talked about something that's very, very significant, and that is that finally renewables are coming down in cost. And I think as empirical proof, other than just looking at the numbers, unfortunately there's a backlash to it. Very recently, like last week, I believe, Oklahoma started charging for solar panel usage. Individuals. High numbers. I'm not sure, but I think something like $100 per month. Kansas also did the same thing, which is, of course, the backyard of Koch brothers. And the question that I have for you is, yes, we think we're in democracy, but unfortunately we're in an oligarchy. And Koch brothers and others have a lot of more representation than we and you do. So the question is, how can we combine better? Maybe you already answered it by saying using the social media and other modes like that. But is it possible also to not just use what you said that has not worked in the past, and that is just the carbon tax, but really incentivate to a maximum extent, more incentivate companies and businesses, small and large, to be able to go into renewables, and especially for the large ones, to be able to see that they get more of an advantage financially by building up their portfolio of energy businesses towards the renewables. And by that, I don't mean just the big oil and gas companies. I mean Con Edison. I mean anybody that is a big consumer of energy.
First, I think the energy industry, particularly the local utilities, they're highly regulated. They're regulated by states, and they can be pushed through public policy. And I also think that the tax code can be used to provide incentives for renewable energy, just as for anything else. And I think part of it is, particularly as these prices come down and this becomes more feasible, some political pressure needs to be deployed to push for these kinds of policies.
I'm Kathleen Quain. I'm a health advocate and have been an NGO for 10 years working on climate change. I believe the solutions exist. We have the Ford. Before we think of funding science, would the Earth Institute be willing to be a container to hear civil society's solutions? We have free energy. We have CO2 emission reduction technologies. There are extraordinary philanthropists and professors and individuals who are doing amazing work. It's just not all collected in one place. So would the Earth Institute be willing to listen to the people? Because the governments need businesses, and the businesses need the people, and the people have the answers.
The collection of faculties speak for them. They speak for themselves, and if you have 30 faculty in a room, you have 30 different voices. But I think what you're saying certainly sounds of interest to my colleagues.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Novum Aoyang, and I'm from the New York City Parks Department. I work for the New York City Parks Department, but my question is more about coastal resilience more generally. I guess I agree that, you know, if we should not subsidize flood insurance, we should not develop in flood-prone areas, but what do we do about the people that are already there? Where do they go? Where do we move the thousands of people that live in Jamaica Bay, and with, you know, New York City being famous for its high real estate prices, where do we place all those people? And that's it.
Obviously, nobody is talking about massive relocation that would occur in any sort of rapid time frame. I think we're talking about an aspirational goal of, over time, first of all, guaranteeing that more people don't locate in vulnerable areas. So that seems obvious they're not there. As I said, it's not finally a legal issue. That's why I wanted to clean out the underbrush of law, although it has instructive elements in it for us to think about the issue. It's really finally an ethical issue, which I think is imposed both on the individual and on groups. And as I said in concluding, first of all, in any sort of policy that one would have with regard to location decisions, particularly with regard to existing people, and particularly with regard to lower income people, we simply cannot have a policy where people are necessarily moved out. At the same time, we have to start putting in place transitional rules that will take a long time, coupled with compensation, as the reality of guaranteeing that as we move forward, we don't exacerbate the problem, and indeed, as we move forward, we mitigate the problem, recognizing that the amount of money we'll be spending to help out in the future could, in fact, fund the very possibility of providing funds to people. Finally, place is fundamental. You know, money or compensation for a house is not the same as owning the house. Some of you may know about the Kelo versus City of New London case from 2005. It was a very famous United States Supreme Court case in which the court held and said that the City of New London, through a particular development corporation, could exercise the power of eminent domain to actually take single-family homeowners' houses against their will. Now, compensation would be paid, but the houses could be taken, demolished, and a new development could take place. And among the homeowners was Wilhelmina Derry, a woman who was born in her house, I think it was in 1918, and had lived there her whole life. Her husband was a sort of latecomer. I think he had only been there for 50 or 60 years. And she just didn't want the money, or at least as far as we know, she didn't want the money. I mean, nobody offered her $10 million for her house, so maybe there was a price. People are very attached to place, to community, to where they were born. So I think these things have to be taken deeply seriously. And so the answer is, like everything we've been saying, we don't really have great answers, but we have ways of thinking about it and ways of setting up processes, and hopefully the processes can act fast enough, in this case on adaptation and resilience and locational strategies, that will keep pace with the sea level rise going up in feet or inches or millimeters. Well, that's
just to add in one aspect, simple point of view, I think flood management has been mostly focused on flood control, that in places along the Mississippi, we get the Army Corps to build structures that keep the water away, and coastal protection has been geared pretty much in the same way. And so you keep people dry, and that obviously doesn't work. But the consciousness hasn't shifted accordingly. And so I think we're caught a little bit thinking that there's a kind of bimodal situation that you're either safe or totally unsafe. And if you look at other natural hazards, we deal with degrees of safety. We deal with the possibility of losing property but saving lives. We have the advantage with floods that we have a certain amount of warning so we can evacuate. So once we accept the fact that it's what Bob Twilley in Louisiana calls controlled flooding, not flood control, then we can build the rockaways, we can adapt the rockaways quite easily. The Parks Department is involved in the new boardwalk. The Army Corps is building a new sand dune. There are thoughts about what to do on the Back Bay side. But more importantly, moving utilities up above the flood level, being conservative about what that flood level is. So many things that can be done to improve the resilience of those communities at low cost. And that's a big step. And maybe it's enough of a step in the long run that not that many people have to move out. So I think we have to get away from this idea that you're either totally safe and you can forget about the problem or always in danger.
I'm very sorry for the people standing, but we have only time for one more question.
Yeah, my name is Jairus Musyoka. I'm from Kenya. And first of all, I thank the New School for this opportunity to be here today. Mine, maybe the panel, you'll excuse me, it's not maybe directed to what you are saying, or rather what we are discussing here is on third world countries. How are you doing to mitigate, or rather involve third world countries in whatever you're doing? I'll first talk about what Professor Cohen has said, that for the few years that we have seen cell phone mobile transforming the world. And I'll give a practical example of Kenya, where people have used mobile phones to transfer money from different areas, and we no longer go to banks. If you go to rural area, there are no banks and people are transferring funds. How are you going to do to involve third world countries in what you are doing? Thank you.
I think the answer is to try to imitate what happened with the cell phones. And there are a lot of reasons why that took place. One of the main reasons, frankly, is the seductiveness of the technology and the attractiveness of it to the people all over the world for a whole variety of purposes. I think that if we were to develop an energy technology of that scale and of that convenience, it could have the same transformative impact that you saw in the cell phones. And I think what is necessary is the technology, and then, frankly, they sell them. They don't, I mean, they give them away a little bit, but they mainly sell them, and there's a market for them, and this is one of the places where capitalism actually can work. Doesn't work everywhere, but it works there.
I don't know if we want to end the New School panel on capitalism working, but it is 5:30, and on behalf of the New School, I want to thank you, Stephen, Jerold, Michael, and Guy, for a wonderful afternoon.